So today we are going to learn about carbon finance and climate finance. These are two different things, and we'll get to know more about what each one is. And as you do that, you'll also understand what the difference between these two terms are: carbon finance and climate finance. But before we go into today's topic, I want to harp on a little bit more about what I mentioned last time, the United Nations Friendly Relations Declaration of 1970. There's another reason why I mentioned this declaration. I'd ask you to go to this link to read a short article. This is a blog article in the European Journal of International Law's online blog called EGIL Talk. This was an article written on the UN Friendly Relations Declaration at 50 years of age, from 1970 to 50 years on. Now, in this article, the author not only talks about how the 1970 declaration was so important in international relations in post-Second World War geopolitics, that he calls it the Constitution, and then he calls it the forgotten Constitution, right? But along with that, he talks also about public international law, of which a large part is international treaties. Rules are made through one of the key sources of public international law, which is treaties. And he talks about the whole area of public international law as also being forgotten. Now, why do I mention this in the context of this course, which is what I've titled as Legal Implications of Climate Change? I want to capture various different areas of law, various different types of dispute resolution forums where this whole topic of climate change has come up. But I can situate that, very much within public international law, but within a notion of public international law, which is nowadays less used. At times when we have a lot of specialization, a lot of narrow specialization, we tend to forget that. So this first slide is a reminder to base your understanding of whatever we have looked at so far in the last 5 sessions and what we're going to look at in the next 3 sessions have to be contextualized within this broader approach. You've got to stand back from, the fragmentation of international law into these specialized fields. You have trade law, you have investment law, you have environmental law, you have human rights law. All of these distinctions, you have to remember that there is a common source where the rules are based in values in public international law. And one of the key values is about international cooperation, maintaining friendly relations, maintenance of international peace, and thereby security, right? So it has to be mired in that. We'll see how in the future it's possible that there may be conflict based on, how climate change pans out. That conflict could be because we have lots of migration. That conflict could be because we have a lot of competition for resources that are necessary for making the energy transition. So I'm laying the ground now to understand international law and its values more deeply, so that you have enough of skills and techniques that you can then apply to address challenging issues in the future, a lot of which could potentially be a result of the changes we make in international relations because of the UN climate regime. There's a quote from this article which I want to draw your attention to. So the author goes on to say, as far as the UN Friendly Relations Declaration, which he abbreviates as FRD, Friendly Relations Declaration. He looks at it from the perspective of how international law is studied, is understood, is taught. Something more than the FRD has been lost, okay? Namely, a general or a generalist perspective of international law, or a big picture of the interrelations across the values and their general expression in legal norms and processes. Okay, a highly theoretical statement, but one you need to reflect on, analyze, and bring examples that you know from your study into illustrating this particular statement, right? So there are lots of aspects in international law that have been forgotten over time, which do need to come back now in the context of understanding how climate change related regulation and laws is going forward. Yeah. So this is another view on what I said in my first and second sessions about the nature of climate change law. Okay, it might have stemmed from environmental law, but the rules in it really encompass and affect quite a few areas of law. Yeah, so that was one approach or one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is that the values that are being given expression through legal norms in the UN climate change regime very much come from one general source. If you take that big picture view of ordering of international relations through international law. Okay, so that is some pointers about the depth in which you need to be understanding the Paris Agreement, the UN FCCC, and the evolving framework that these fundamental international instruments are causing. Okay, so with that, let's go to today's topic. The lecture structure. The first part deals with carbon finance. There's a few acronyms there. Some familiar, some not familiar. You have got the PA, which is Paris Agreement. We'll come back and look at Article 6. Clean CDM, which is the Clean Development Mechanism. That's what CDM stands for. CDM transition, the transitioning of the Clean Development Mechanism. Then VCM, which stands for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So with this, you get a full picture of what constitutes carbon finance. After which we'll move to climate finance, get an understanding of what this is, look at adaptation costs and risks. So one of the things you need climate finance for is adaptation. You need it for mitigation as well, but we have dealt with mitigation so far quite in some depth, but we haven't looked so much at adaptation. So I'm using this opportunity as a vehicle to understand adaptation as well. And there's a reason why I'm doing that here, because the legal structure for adaptation is not as developed as mitigation. And one of the key things about adaptation is that it needs a lot of money. So looking at adaptation from the context of climate finance is a good way of approaching it, given that the legal rules are less structured than mitigation. So like the NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution, which mainly focuses on adaptation, on mitigation, you also have something known as National Adaptation Plans, NAP, okay? But there is no obligation that NAPs have to be given. There is no obligation that you have to report in a certain way. There are no MRV requirements, the measuring, reporting, verification. So all of that, that's why I said the rules around adaptation are not that strongly framed. Okay, so that's adaptation costs and risks. And then finally, we look at inclusive finance. Okay. So let's look at the font of our Of course, the Paris Agreement, the reigning agreement currently as part of the UNFCCC family of agreements. It crystallizes a lot and takes forward a lot from the very initial United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1994. So the article we are focusing on in the Paris Agreement is Article 6, Section 2. So Article 6, Section 1 establishes the idea that it's possible to take approaches that are across borders. Article 6.2 specifically states that on a voluntary basis, it's possible for the parties to the agreement to take cooperative approaches. And that approach is for transferring mitigation outcomes. Okay. But at the same time, it has to promote sustainable development. It has to ensure environmental integrity and transparency. It also has to apply robust accounting. And there needs to be avoidance of double counting. Now, all of this can only be understood if we understand the earlier context for the Paris Agreement, because Article 6 builds on the Kyoto Protocol. Okay. So for now, let's build an understanding of these concepts and then go on to the Kyoto Protocol. So the Paris Agreement's main innovation is this concept of nationally determined contribution. And what is the nationally determined contribution? It is a contribution towards reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions of every party to the Paris Agreement. So in order to reduce the GHG emission, it makes various changes in its economy, right? So in various sectors of its economy, it makes changes. So one of them is the energy transition. Another is how its agricultural practices are done. Another is how transport happens. It could be active transport. People could just stop using energy. So try cycling and go walking. Active transport, or it could be, your transition to a different form of energy source away from fossil fuel. And then you look at, so these are the different ways in which the nationally determined contribution takes mitigation action. The outcome for that is there will be territorial reductions of GHG. Now, let's say that one country has been very successful in reducing its GHG emissions. What it can do then, it goes over and beyond its nationally determined contributions documents promises. Then another country which has not been able to have the same level of success in its mitigation outcomes can request this other country saying, would you want to transfer the GHG reduction that you have now acquired that is over and above surplus for you, for your policy, and give it over to me? Okay, and in return, I will be able to provide various different benefits, including benefits such as promotion of sustainable development and ensuring environmental integrity. Yeah. So this is what is known as cooperative approach. And this cooperative approach is on a voluntary basis. Yeah. It's left to the parties to do. As far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, they're going to hold you to account at the global stocktake in relation to the achievement of your NDC. How you do it is left to you. But Article 6.2 now allows, or in fact, it encourages parties to take these cooperative approaches. So from a broader public international law perspective, we already saw, like I said in my previous slide, it's all about international cooperation. It's all about coexistence. Okay, so peace and security is guaranteed if countries, know what's going on in each other's, do not intervene, but also help each other. So its cooperation is definitely a theme necessary for the coexistence of countries. So that's what this does. But at the same time, it has to be at standards that are required. Because remember, the main problem we are trying to address is Article 2. Overall, we do need to reduce anthropogenic GHG emissions. So we need to make sure that it doesn't do so by spoiling environment. It doesn't do so by not revealing exactly what the reductions have been. It has to be transparent. And also it has to be very clear. The accounting needs to make sure that it's, accurate. It cannot be doing double counting. Why are these things specifically mentioned? Yeah. So it could have been mentioned because before 2015, some of these things have actually occurred, right? They haven't done some robust accounting. They have done some double counting. And in the name of projects for reducing emissions, they have not brought about sustainable development, or they have detrimentally affected the sustainable development of a region. So because all of this may have happened, the Paris Agreement has a need to stress that that shouldn't really happen. So the next few slides, that's what we're going to see. What happened in the run-up to the Paris Agreement such that all of these different principles are being enshrined in Article 6.2. For that, we need to go earlier back in the family of UNFCCC treaties. The Kyoto Protocol, another treaty, same standing as the Paris Agreement. 1997 came into force way into the 2000s. So to give a bit of a background on this treaty, this was a clear illustration of the key principle in the UN climate regime of common but differentiated responsibilities. And the countries or the parties to the UNFCCC were divided into two groups. One is Annex 1 countries, another is countries that are not part of Annex 1. They had different obligations. Okay, so that was the context in which the Kyoto Protocol laid out principles. Now, the provision that relates to Article 6 of Paris Agreement in the Kyoto Protocol is Article 12. Article 12.2 is the one I want us to focus on here. So Article 12.1 establishes something known as the Clean Development Mechanism. And Article 12.2 talks about the purpose of this Clean Development Mechanism. So what is the purpose, right? So Clean Development Mechanism should assist the parties not included in Annex 1 in achieving sustainable development. So you can roughly equate countries or parties that are not included in Annex 1 as developing countries. Okay, as countries that have had less to do with the problem of global warming. So the countries that have industrialized much slower, the countries that have not contributed in the same volume as some other countries have contributed. So Annex 1 countries have contributed a lot more in terms of volume of anthropogenic GHG, whereas the parties that are not included in Annex 1 have contributed much lesser. So Clean Development Mechanism, firstly, the name itself, Clean Development Mechanism, it basically means development projects, but development projects that specifically link to the aims of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's why they are called, that's why you can make out a difference between general development projects and development projects that take place in the context of climate change. A lot of projects now take place in the context of climate change. Yeah, whether it's a road, whether it is, building new buildings, whether it is reforesting or even cutting down forests, they all are in the context of, they all seem to have a purpose in the context of climate change. But still, there is a difference between development and climate-related development projects. So the Clean Development Mechanism, it is to help parties, developing countries, in achieving sustainable development. Now, who is responsible to help the parties do this? Parties included in Annex 1. But parties do that. It's like two birds in one stone. On the one hand, you have sustainable development going to parties that are developing countries. And then on the other hand, the benefit for the developed countries is that they achieve their quantified emission limitation and their reduction commitments. So under Article 3 of the Kyoto Protocol, Annex 1 countries all have a target of reduction of their anthropogenic GHG by a certain percentage. So they all have agreed to do that. Whereas in the Kyoto Protocol, there was no such obligation at all in terms of mitigation for any of the developing countries. So just to remind you, that's what changed between Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. Right. So Paris Agreement, all the parties to the Paris Agreement are required to take mitigation action, to take adaptation action, everything as appropriate. Whereas as far as the Kyoto Protocol was concerned, that wasn't the case. Yeah. But this Article 12 tried to link the Annex 1 countries and the non-Annex 1 countries together by saying Annex 1 can reduce their emissions and non-Annex can gain the benefit from projects that will reduce the emissions and will aid in the sustainable development of non-Annex 1 countries. Okay, so this is what is called the Clean Development Mechanism. So how does this work? We need to understand some principles and nature of this clean development mechanism to assess or to comment on its utility and its function going into the future. So CDM, it is what is known as a flexible mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah. So it is left up to countries how they decide they want to use the CDM. They can decide to take part in it. They can decide to take part in it in using certain types of projects. So there is no stricture around how they use this voluntary approach. So it's a flexible mechanism. At its core, it's a project-based market mechanism, and it helps offset emissions from Annex 1 countries. Yeah, because there are some parts of industry that unavoidably use or unavoidably produce GHG. So the steelmaking industry is one such example. And without the steelmaking industry, a lot of the infrastructure around the world will not get built. So steelmaking is absolutely essential. Nowadays, they're trying to shift the source of energy for steel to hydrogen, but it's still quite expensive. Scalability is still an issue. There are efforts going on, but nevertheless, there is a category of emissions that can be unavoidable. So if they're unavoidable, then in order to meet the targets under the Kyoto Protocol, in order to meet their obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, they're going to have to make an alternative arrangement for it. That is what is known as offsetting emissions. So it will be in another territory. They will buy the emissions, a reduction from another territory, and they'll use it to offset their unavoidable emissions. And CDM at its heart is project-based. So it's left to the development of a project. A project usually will have a start or a finish date. It will typically have a life of a certain period. So that's the nature of the project, right? And it's a market mechanism. So it's possible also to be able to enhance the value of what comes out of these projects. Let's say, so the currency that was created because the Kyoto Protocol is basically carbon credits, okay? So carbon finance comes from this notion of carbon credits. So the carbon credits, the value of the carbon credit will move up or down It all depends on how many projects there are, what is considered as unavoidable in certain countries that they're not able to offset, they're not able to reduce themselves. If there is more of that, then the price of these credits will go up. If not, so essentially the principle is that it is a market mechanism. So this is the key thing you need to understand. A CDM, the carbon credits that flow from the clean development mechanism, they're all project-based market mechanism regulated credits. There was one principle that was clearly laid out, is additionality. Okay. So there has to be additionality as a result of any project that is proposed under CDM. If it does not have additionality, then it's not going to be counted as a CDM project, eligible to be a CDM project. So taking you back to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, I asked you to just understand what the phrases in the article were. And I said there was a background to that, and that's how we came into the Kyoto Protocol. And one of the phrases over there was, it shouldn't be double counted. There should be a robust governance of any kind of mitigation outcome that is created. All of that links to this principle of additionality. So what do we mean when we say additionality? So looking at this graph, let's say that this area that is striped over here, this little hillock which is striped up. So these are the projects that would take place under the scenario of BAU, business as usual, meaning that a country has decided they are, as a party to the UNFCCC, they're taking measures on mitigation. Okay, and they initiate projects in various sectors or initiate policies which lead to projects, and you have this level of activity which leads to reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, none of this will account as projects under the clean development mechanism. You need to have this additional layer, okay? You need to have projects outside of any regulatory requirements, outside of anything that would have happened anyway, okay? And you need to be able to show that you can generate what is known as CER, certified emissions reduction, okay? So carbon credits is a colloquial name for it. The technical name is certified emissions reduction. It's not that difficult to grasp what it means. So emissions reduction is a reference to greenhouse gas emissions reduction, certified. So an independent authority needs to be able to certify saying these are actual valid emissions reduction. So that means they should give you an idea that it's a process it goes through, which is something we'll look at in the next slide. So as far as the amount of CERs that are produced will need to come only from this area. So unless it's possible to establish it unequivocally that any emissions reduction, which have to be, according to the Kyoto Protocol, certified in a certain process, are actually over and above any of the projects that would have existed given the trajectory of policy that was ongoing in the country at that time. So in order to be part of the clean development mechanism, it needs to have this additionality, additional emissions reductions that will be generated. Now, it will make, it makes logical sense, because if one country is going to another country and saying, we have emitted extra, so we need to make sure that in order to offset that, you need to help us by doing some emissions reduction. Now, if those emissions reductions are part of that country and their NDC, then overall, as far as the UNFCCC goal of reducing emissions is concerned, is not going to be helped unless this country B produces over and above extra. Yeah. So that's the logic of the principle of additionality. So we'll now look at how the certified emissions reduction, or the CERs, are produced. It's quite a long and complex process. The CDM project flow process, as you call it. This harks back to the features of the UN climate regime that I identified at the very beginning, saying that there is a managerial approach and there is an administrative approach that these laws take. And this is one example, one clear example of how it takes this administrative approach. So here's a graphic now of what happens. I don't expect you to read the whole of it, but let me run you through it to show you the level of administrative governance that has taken place as part of the UN climate regime. So for the clean development mechanism to work, it starts with a project developer proposing a project. This can be any entity that can develop and produce a project. Okay, it's not government related. It can be private. More often it is private. So as an identification of project, there's a development of project concept. Then that needs to go into something that is presentable, and lots of requirements, as you would expect in any kind of big project. What is the description? What is the approach? They have to be able to produce their own calculation of additionality. So they have to talk about what would that country otherwise have been doing, or that region otherwise have been producing. And if this project comes on board, what is the additional emissions reduction it actually can make happen? Set the baseline emission and also the crediting period. So some of the technical aspects around carbon accounting has to be included as well. And then there has to be the project management. They have to monitor, things have to be on time. Then the ESG elements. So the social, environmental, what are the impacts? So all of the environmental laws and any other laws relating to project in that particular country have to be complied with as well. Local stakeholder participation. So procedural justice also needs to be taken into account. Everything according to the laws of the local jurisdiction. So that is the project developer's role. And then it goes on to the host country that needs to be approved. So there are nationally designated authorities known as NDAs. So these are one central body in a host country. The host country would usually be a party to the UNFCCC. So the host country has to approve that. And the host country essentially looks at what is the sustainable development benefit that is coming to my population, my region, and anyone else affected by it. So the host countries and the nationally designated authority has the role of ensuring that this project will bring development to the region. And they'll have a host of different issues, which is not necessarily transparent, but it could include a number of benefits like creation of jobs, new technology coming in, innovation. It could also mean a new infrastructure. So various different types of sustainable development benefits. What I'll do is we're going to do an in-class activity where we're going to look at some of the SD benefits in particular that have come out from some of these projects. So we'll look at that in more detail at that point. But at the second stage, the host government has to approve, and this is what they will be looking for when they try and approve. This then goes on to something known as an operational entity, which is another term that's used in the CDM technical phraseology. An operational entity is nothing but a completely independent entity. There'll be an auditing entity, and they essentially look at both aspects of the project. They look at what is the benefits emissions reductions benefits from the project that's been proposed, and overall, has the country approved it? And then they have to validate it independently. Once they validate it independently, then it goes in as a CDM project, right? The CDM project then will have to, it's free to now be established and start producing the CERs. And at the end of which, again, it comes back, suppose the expected result from the project is then collected, it is verified, it is certified, at the end of which you get the CERs. So this essentially is how the CDM, this is essentially transnational cooperation, cooperative approaches towards mitigation. And this is something that was functional within the Kyoto Protocol regime. Now, the Kyoto Protocol, the predecessor of the Paris Agreement, and the arrangements under the Kyoto Protocol now have come to an end. Okay, so the Kyoto Protocol was functional, but now we've moved away from the Kyoto Protocol because it has been supplanted by the Paris Agreement. Yeah. And what is the main difference between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement? Obligations for addressing climate change falls now under the Paris Agreement on all the parties, whereas previously that obligation in Kyoto Protocol fell only from the Annex 1 countries. So that has shifted a lot of things, and it is then shifting the CDM mechanism as well. Now, before I move on further, so when we talk about carbon credits, the only category of carbon credits is not CER. And the CDM mechanism is not the only mechanism, again, under the Kyoto Protocol. There's a couple of other mechanisms that I'm not going to go into today. While this CDM is a project-based mechanism, there's something called joint implementation, which is more between countries. So it's more a bilateral arrangement for jointly doing mitigation projects. So there are credits which have got a slightly different name under that, but they all come within this idea of transferable credits that are generated from projects. Right. So having looked at what the mechanism is, the projects from the CDM mechanism, from the Kyoto Protocol arrangements, brought quite a lot of benefits. And what is the key measure of the benefits? They have to reduce emissions of GHG. That certainly did happen. Okay. And there were quite a few projects too. But at the same time, there were quite a few problems. And this is one of the reasons why, when the Kyoto Protocol is being wound up, the question of how the CDM moves forward needs to be looked at more carefully to make sure we implement reforms and then take it forward if we do plan to take it forward. Right. Now, the link that you see here on the screen, you will be able to go and look at the CDM projects in every country. So this is a list of the designated national authority in every country. And if you go in there, you can also have a look at what period in time, what projects, and what sort of mitigation efforts they led to. Okay, so the key problems, they can be understood as under two different headings. There were governance gaps that arose in the process of administering the CDM, and these governance gaps then led to justice issues. Okay, now these two don't necessarily coincide. I've put it as a table. If you notice, I haven't actually divided the justice issues into actual rows. It's just in one big column, and that is deliberate because there is no direct correlation. However, you can, there is some amount of correlation. So governance gaps leading to justice issues. Let's look at some of the governance gaps in these projects. The project developer and the project approver the government authority that will approve, there was found to be nexus between the aims of both of them. And that didn't necessarily translate into benefits for sustainable development that did hinder environmental governance, etc. So that was a governance gap in terms of trying to keep the conflict of interest clearly out of the way when a project developer would be approved by a particular government. Often you'll have the government coming up with an idea and then asking a project developer to take that up and to bring it to them and so that they can approve it. Whereas it should really be the other way around. But there's also other issues of weak governance. So corruption and collusion were also found. So we are talking about a large number of countries with weak governance. So we're not, the approver government is the host country, and the host country is the non-annexed country. So it's the developing countries. Okay, so bear in mind the context. So this was one key governance gap that did hinder benefits flowing from the CDM projects. Lack of national or approval capacity. Not all the problems arose because of corruption or collusion, but they simply also arose because there wasn't enough national capacity to be able to understand what the project was, to be able to independently assess. Often then they relied on the project developer themselves to give some answers. And you can see how the possibility of the project developer, keeping silent on certain things and probably projecting certain other things that could have led to the sort of collusion or, a lack of a proper assessment for approval. So lack of national capacity continues to be an issue. And quite a few efforts are happening on the ground now for improving national capacity. So the United Nations Environmental Programme runs, continuous capacity building sessions. But at the same time, the UN regime itself wants a country-driven approach for obvious reasons, okay, because you don't want a lot of intrusion from non-state actors or those outside of the government, those outside of that state, to be able to dictate a lot of these administrative issues, because these all deal directly with projects, with the land, with the community, with benefits. So these are all welfare measures or governance measures that countries need to do for themselves as part of, their sovereign remit. So there needs to be that balance that is kept between, capacity, but at the same time allowing countries to take a country-driven, locally responsive approach to what projects they want to see happen in their communities, in their area. The developer and DOE collusion. So this is the independent authority as well. Now, the collusion is there because both have the same aim. Okay, the developer wants to show that they are able to produce greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The designated authority also, or the designated operating entity also wants to show that there's benefits in terms of emissions reduction. So in a way, since they are going towards the same goal, they each sometimes in some projects have been fudging, if you like, the lines. So, if in doubt, they put it as, okay, this probably contributes to emissions reduction, rather than being strict about how they would exclude something if they were unsure. So there was that sort of collusion of the overall aims, which means that there were more projects that went through, but not so much equivalent emissions reduction gains that eventually made it at the end of the project. Sustainable benefits not credited. Now, this is perhaps one of the biggest problems of CDM. So when we looked at the structure of the article in the treaty, quite clearly they started off by saying Annex 1, non-Annex 1 countries can be helped in their sustainable development. How? Because Annex 1 countries want to meet their quantified emissions reduction targets. Now, how easy is it to measure these two things? The whole setup of this CDM project approval process itself is skewed towards more accurately measuring emissions reduction than it is about assessing sustainable development benefits. Okay. So the host country has almost the sole authority and responsibility to determine sustainable development benefits. Okay. And there are problems with it. I mean, the whole idea was to say you should have one without, you cannot have one without the other. But eventually what happened was there were a lot of emissions reduction, but correspondingly, the sustainable development benefits were very doubtful, right? And some of the justice issues will help you understand, what I mean by sustainable development benefits not realized to the extent that the emissions reductions benefit wasn't realized. So before going into the justice issues, the context for the justice issue is that the climate issue for most people in terms of volume of populations is more a justice issue. Yeah? Because the vast majority of the global population has been less responsible for causing the problem. Yeah. So at the heart of the legal framework is this recognition. So when assessing any part of this regime, we need to have that principle fundamentally in mind. So it is about a just transition. As much as emissions reductions are necessary, there is no point if in the process of emissions reduction, we still have lost half of the world's population because, the climate risk has materialized because we're not doing much about it. Yeah, so we need to transition fast as well as just. Both are equally important. So from that context, let's look at the justice issues. Now, the feature of the CDM, non-Annex 1 countries. Yeah, it includes the least developed countries, the vulnerable countries, and the developing countries. Yeah, and even within the developing countries, right? I mean, if you look at a graph of where a lot of the CDM projects went, the biggest share went to China. So geographically, China hosted a lot of CDM projects. After that came India. There were very, very few in parts of Africa. There was quite a few in South Africa comparatively, but really nothing much in other parts of Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa, hardly any at all, right? So given that that is the picture, looking at, India and China, the two big places with the CDM projects, even within that, even within India and China, the regions are unequal, okay? I mean, India, home to the world's largest poor, okay? So poorest regions of India, even though India is not a least developed or vulnerable as a whole, but the poorest regions within that country are the ones that have hosted CDM projects for various reasons, okay? It could be, let's say, a hydropower project. And what do you need for a hydropower project? Okay, you do need rivers and you do need fast flowing rivers. Where do you get them? Not in the middle of the city. You would get them more in rural areas. And we know the urban rural divide in terms of, all different factors, whether it is wealth or whether it is education, etc., and development. There's a huge difference with the rural lagging behind, right? So the poorest regions host the CDM projects. And the irony is that they have contributed least to the problem, but now they are at the front line. They're giving up their land and they are, they are exposed to the risk of these new projects. And they somehow are now in the front line for our fight against climate change. Now, from a justice point of view, that's definitely an issue, right? So on the one hand, you can say this is solidarity wherever is possible, whichever region there is space, well, we should use it, or whichever region has resources, we should use it. But from a justice point of view, they have contributed least, but they're the ones now again being called for to contribute to. So that's what's happened in the CDM projects. They've gone and situated, a lot of the CDM project have situated themselves within populations which are least contributing to this problem. Carbon financing exacerbate existing social and environmental injustices. Okay, so this again is it's quite complex. It's quite debatable. To illustrate it by giving an example, there was a project, a clean development mechanism project that was developed to capture methane that was coming out of landfills, right? So if you dump a lot of solid waste, then it starts degrading, decomposing, and while it does that, it gives out gases, one of which is methane. So landfills are places where there's a lot of dump of the waste material, which then starts emitting the methane gas. Now, the CDM project was fine, was good. So it was set up to basically capture the methane so that it doesn't go into the atmosphere and then contribute to the warming. So the CDM project managed to do that. It was approved by the host country and it was also executed. But the context within which this took place, right, was problematic. Why? Because this landfill, which had been expanding over the years, as you can imagine, around the world, production and consumption has been increasing, and therefore waste has been expanding. So the community or the town outside or in the vicinity of which the landfill was operating had been fighting for a long time for closing down the landfill. Okay, so as such, should have been closed down. But the CDM project, the methane capture project, gave it new lease of life by coming in and setting up the CDM project, capturing the methane, but a lot of the other issues, the proximity of this community to the landfill, etc., in a way persisted. Yeah. So that's why the existing social environmental injustice still carried on. And in some ways, the CDM project here led to an exacerbation. It could potentially have been, a case that the landfill may have been, closed down, but because there was an opportunity for a CDM project, now you can ask, well, who's to blame? Coming back to some of the governance gaps there. Why was it approved? Yeah. Was it approved in a way that it took into account, local participatory approaches? What was the resolution for, the problem that already existed there, etc. So this is just one of number of examples of how CDM projects then have caused some of these existing problems to either prolong or in some cases, probably just increase as well. All right. The conserved resource versus the carbon value. Right. So this is another justice issue, because you have to remember that when we're talking about justice, we are talking about individuals, we are talking about communities. We are not talking about the whole of humanity per se. Okay, the whole idea of justice is that I have been wronged or my group has been wronged, right? So you've got to have that really in mind. We're not looking at what are the other side effects and benefits of it. We have to focus on what's actually, at an individual level, at a collective group level, what rights have been affected, what injustice has been perpetrated. So this whole idea of conserving a conserved resource versus a carbon value. This comes up in the context of forests, for example. Yeah. So we all know forests are carbon sinks, and it would be great to have more and more carbon sinks. So there is a value in conserving the forests, yeah, a conserved resource. But at the same time, so this might bring benefit for two things. One is the overall emissions reductions agenda for the whole of the globe. The other is it will bring benefits for that country as a whole, yeah, because they can discharge their obligations, being members of this climate change treaty. But what about the local people? What about people who have been depending on, let's say, going into the forest and using it in certain ways? Okay, they might find value in actually burning up that carbon. While on the one hand, we have the concept of unavoidable emissions, who do we offer that concept to? If we offer the unavoidable emissions to the steelmaking industry, should we then offer this unavoidable emissions to the local people who make use of the forests and who might use that resource as a burnt resource or in some other form? Okay, not necessarily as a conserved resource. Okay. So this again causes a problem when it comes to a justice problem when it comes to the running of CDM projects. Procedural justice. So everything depends on the national authority in terms of what they consider as sustainable development, who they talk to know what is sustainable development. And this has inevitably given rise to issues of procedural justice. Whose voice is heard, and then whose voice actually determines and takes the decision. How much of a say there is for different levels of governance. That could either be, the national designated authority will have the ultimate say, but how is it structured? Do they really have to talk to local government, for example? And that local government could be still at a high level, or it could be very much at the community level. But what is the governance structure? How much of a voice is given? So what is whether procedural justice in terms of participatory rights and transparency has been followed, and what also is the standard of procedural justice that is actually maintained, right? So a huge number of issues have been unearthed as a result of the proceeding, if you like, of the Kyoto Protocol. Okay. What do we have now? Right. We talked about the Paris Agreement. We talked about the Kyoto Protocol. We know that the Kyoto Protocol is being retired and the Paris Agreement is taking over. Now, in that context, there is also a CDM transition. Okay. There's various different dates. The transition is actually happening right now as we speak. In fact, there's a whole process of what kind of projects can be taken over. Some projects may still be continuing. There are some projects which may be scaled up or has the potential to scale up. All of that has been affected because of the change of the regime from Kyoto Protocol onto the Paris Agreement. So all that has to be managed. Right. So what's happening is there is a carryover from the CDM mechanism into the Paris Agreement. Like we saw, Article 6 supports this sort of a project-based market mechanisms, as well as bilateral implementation, cooperation for emissions reduction. I mean, if you're really interested to see what stage and what levels there are, then you can have a look at the Article 6 pipeline, as well as the CDM and Joint Implementation JI pipeline on the United Nations Environmental Programme's website. And they have a separate section specifically for the climate change regime. There's over 1,500 projects at the moment across the globe that's being carried over. And some of them are using the same sort of methodologies for calculating the sustainable development benefits, as well as calculating the emissions reduction, etc., that they are going to carry over. So it's a question now of looking at how do they fit? Do they comply with the Paris Agreement Article 6 mechanism. So that's what we're going to see. This is another development you want to watch over this year and next. The deadline for submission of different project activities, program activities, or components of program activities. So there are different names for different types of projects, categories of projects. These are all being registered under the new mechanism. And I think the last date was somewhere at the end of last year, 2023. So we can watch out to see what's going to be approved now under the new regime. Okay. Any questions so far? Are you all with me?
We are.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Oh.
Professor.
Hi, Tamerlane. Nice to see you. I didn't see you last class. You're the one who comes on camera, so I know it when you don't come.
I will turn it on.
Okay. All right. So this is all about the treaty-based mechanism. But let's say you've gone on a website and booked a flight. And if you've been, patient enough to go through all the different options they ask you, saying, do you want insurance? Do you want to, pay money and book your seat? Do you want food? Do you want extra baggage, etc., etc., etc.? And all of that, then there's one more thing which says, do you want to offset your carbon footprint that you create from flying? Yeah. So you may have found that if you've booked on any of these big booking sites. Now, that is a carbon offset mechanism, okay? But that's not part of what we've talked about so far, right? So those are what we call the voluntary carbon market. They use the same sort of principles, yeah? The principle is to, say, right, you're flying, it certainly causes this the imprint because the aviation fuel and all the food that is produced that you consume on board, etc. All of them have a emissions footprint, a carbon footprint, and how do you? Here's the opportunity to offset them. So you can pay, like I don't know, I pay like £3 or something when I do a European flight, a 3-hour flight from London. And it varies depending on, and it's all sorts of prices. I've noticed if it was, booked on a certain site, it comes up to £3. If I book on something else, it comes up on as £5. It all varies as well. And there's not much detail as to, how this offsetting actually takes place or where the offsetting takes place. None of that information. But if you go and read in the small print, you potentially could. I've tried to follow it sometimes, but haven't followed it right through to look at how their, carbon emissions reduction is actually monitored and whether they actually get, to what extent the criteria that is used is sound and according to, industry standard principles. I've not gone that far. However, there is a large space out there, which is the VCM space, which we have come across more directly because of the example I just gave you now. There might be other examples as well, but this is the one I come across most commonly. So what exactly is the voluntary carbon market? There's a few things that we need to know. I won't go into too much detail into that because that's a whole separate world out there. But just say two things in this, okay? So the first thing, I draw your attention to the very bottom of the slide, on the bottom left-hand corner, is this website that I've given you a link to. It's called ctxglobal.com. Now, this is a marketplace for the voluntary carbon market, okay? So this is where you can trade. This is where the anyone, so it's got nothing to do with CDM, but anyone following the same sort of an approach, they can come up with projects, and if someone else is interested to buy the potential for emissions reduction from them, they can go ahead and buy it. So you've got that sort of trading. Yeah. And you can name the price. The buyer can name the price of carbon to the seller. And if this exchange, the CTA exchange or carbon trade exchange, essentially creates a market in such transaction. Now, this table of here is about various terminologies that are used, okay, in the voluntary carbon market, because even within that, there's a difference that we can see. And there are some quite big significant ones that we need to take note of. The first term, the global voluntary carbon market. Now, this is the one that you hit on when you're booking your flight and offsetting it, because this global voluntary carbon market is largely unorganized. It's a global ecosystem of traded carbon credits, and it could be carbon removal or carbon avoidance. So what is carbon removal? Once the GHG gas is out, then you capture it back in. Whereas avoidance is basically you put in place a measure such that the GHG gas is not emitted. Both of them will be considered, you need to take positive action to do both. So therefore, you can trade that for a certain market value. So the voluntary demand comes from commercial buyers as well as institutional buyers. Yeah. So it's not that insignificant in terms of what it is either. Yeah, because you have institutional buyers as well as you have commercial buyers. And that is why your, plane company is able to give you that option. Okay, you're not directly going and buying it with someone else, but that option is being offered to you by the company. So that's the commercial buyer. Then you have the voluntary carbon market, VCM. These are quite established. The biggest one that is known, the Chicago Climate Exchange. The Japan GX League is not something I've come across that much, but it's obviously there. So these are marketplaces or market initiatives with defined rules and regulations. So you have some level of certainty as to how the credits are produced, what projects it goes towards, and how they're actually monitored as well. So this guides the supply of the carbon credits as well as the demand and use of these credits. And then you have the compliance carbon market. Compliance carbon market, more directed by the public sector. So this is through regulations, marketplaces in which regulated entities buy and surrender emissions allowance or offset because they have a regulatory target. So this is very much in the model of the international climate framework, but only that this one is much more regional or national. So the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme of the European Union, is one such. The state of California's emission trading scheme. So this is a regulated framework, which means that the bodies that are selling and buying will have also received licenses to do the same. So this is a compliance carbon market. What's a carbon credit or a carbon offset? This is a one tradable unit that represents 1 ton of GHG emissions avoided or removed. Okay, 1 ton of GHG. Does anyone know how much 1 ton is in kilograms?
Um, 1,000?
Yeah, 1,000 kilograms. Yeah. So 1,000 kilograms of, so that's 1 ton. This is from a CSIS center, which is where this slide is from, Energy Security Climate Change Program of CSIS. It's an American-based institution. So it uses the spelling TON, whereas I would normally use TONNE, because that's the British spelling for a ton. And sometimes I find it strange when I see this. So what spelling do you guys use for English? American or British? Or basically whatever word is set up as.
Professor, I use British.
Sorry?
Professor, I use British English.
Ah, you use British.
Yeah.
Yeah. Usually there's always extra letters in British. Yeah. I mean, it used to be much easier to use British, but now, well, when I say now, yeah, for the past 25 years, it's more difficult if you're using an online document because, Microsoft has completely monopolized the market for, typing on the laptop. And even though it has, you can set it at different English settings, I find it annoying. It seems to conveniently slip back into US English most of the time. So that's my bugbear. Removal carbon credit. Credits that represent emissions pulled from the atmosphere and then sequestered. Different techniques. So carbon removal is a whole big technique. There's various different large and small scale capture that can take place. So there's direct air capture. I mean, quite logical. Global warming is caused because there is a high concentration or extra concentration of GHG. So what you do is basically just direct your technology at air and then suck out all of the offending gases. So that's just direct air capture. Biochar. So this is something whereby you can recapture back the GHG in the form of biochar. It's just a couple of examples of different ways of carbon removal. Quite controversial as to the effectiveness of this because of two reasons. One is the technology is expensive for carbon removal, and also the scalability at the pace that we need it is also not available. So it's quite controversial. So it's good to know, what in general, whether it's been from sequestration or whether it's been from other means of carbon credit. Avoidance carbon credit, generally quite desired because of its benefits of, the longevity, the possible sustainable development benefits, etc., that come with avoidance carbon credit. So these are certified emissions reduction from project that reduce emissions compared to an accepted baseline scenario. So it needs to be properly accounted for. Yeah. Example, forestry projects, renewable energy projects, and also carbon capture of flue gases. So these are certain, again, it's a certain type of carbon capture, but it's quite different to the previous types of carbon removal. Okay, so that in sum is an idea of what is carbon finance and the mechanism of CDM, as well as the voluntary market approaches of how either money is created or sustainable development credits are created, or currency by way of certified emissions reduction are created. Right, now what we're going to do is to get you to look at the CDM projects and the sustainable development benefits that the projects claim. So this is an in-class activity. What I want you to do is I want you to pick one report, okay? And I want you to read and I want you to summarize a SD co-benefits report from this webpage, which is here. Right, now this is a microsite. When I had to go in, I had to use or create a login and a password. So if you need one, then you can, create your own, or you're very welcome to use this login and password I've given you over here. So what I'm going to do is to cut and paste this material on the chat box, and I'm going to come out of the slide sharing. And then, so what time is it now? It's 4:36 for me. Is that what, 7:36 for you?
Yes, correct. It's 7:36 here.
Perfect. So let's take about, 10, 15 minutes on this. and we'll have a quick discussion and then go. So just give me 1 second while I paste the task. Okay, so this is the website that I want you to go to. And I want you to tell me if you can actually access the page. So I'm going to share to show you what the page should look like for you. Right, so this is the one. You can see it, right?
Yes, Professor.
Yes, we can see this page.
Excellent. So this is the page you need to get to. So it shows you, it says CDM Sustainable Development Co-Benefits Description Report. Then you have the various co-benefits listed on top over here. That is, you can see air quality, soil quality, water quality, natural resources, job, health, education. So if you want, you can filter out and, look at that as well, or you can just keep it that way. What I want you to look at is this report where it says report and PDF. So what I want you to do is click only that. There's a lot of other material here, which is all about the details of the project. But what I want you to particularly look at is the report. So if you click that report, it will come up to, it won't be too long. Okay, so you will have within the 10 minutes, you can see what it is because it's structured exactly in the same way. So this one, it tells you what the project is. It gives you the location. Then this structure is the same for all the reports. Here it talks about environmental co-benefits on air quality, and then it breaks down, right? So is there any benefit towards reducing sulfur oxide or nitrous oxide or fly ash? Where you find a dot, you might so in this case, for the air quality, it reduces the sulfur oxide highly, it reduces nitrous oxide highly, it reduces fly ash highly, and then it doesn't do other things. Okay, so you can go on looking at it like this. You can focus on one particular co-benefit or look at all the different headings. So here is an environmental one. Here is economic one. You can see whether there are more of economic ones or there are more of environmental ones, because then that'll give you an idea of the justice aspects, okay? And to clarify a little bit more, it gives you some more detail here, okay? Some projects give you some extra information, other projects, don't necessarily like add to the information, like pollution prevention, for example. In this project, it talks about the project shall generate biological solid waste and few end-of-life projects such as heavy machinery, scrap fuel. PP has implemented appropriate water treatment. So it gives you some extra details. Yeah. So it shouldn't be, too onerous for you to have a look at these primary documents, which usually if I were giving it as a, longer task, you will take a lot more time to look at the primary. But I want to give you a flavor of how this is done. Okay, so that's what you're looking for. So now tell me if you yourself are able to access the SD co-benefits page. Do you need the password? Oh, you can go straight in? Oh, good.
Which one should we take? Any or this
Yeah.
exact one?
Just pick any, that's fine. Okay. What did you find? What did you learn? Pankaj?
Yes, Professor. In this type of project, they basically focus on the environment, social, and economic aspect, as well as to improve the quality of life, soil quality, water quality, and creating a jobs, health safety, and education service. In this project, the Professor.
Were you convinced that they bring all these benefits looking at it?
100% not possible, but I think 30-40% possible.
That's your guess, not what
Yeah,
they
yeah,
actually put there.
Yes, Professor.
Which project did you pick up?
Professor, the development of Thana Hydro Power Project, Kenya.
Okay, yeah, I saw that. Yeah. So you have an idea of how these sustainable development benefits are framed.
Yes, Professor. Basically, they mention in the project that we have to focus in this area and reduce the quality, like improve and better for the welfare of the generation. They mention these points.
Yeah, okay, good. Thanks, Pankaj. Anyone else? Did you look at any other project? What's everyone else doing? At least I can see that Tamer is staring into a screen. I don't know what he's reading, but at least I know he is. What about everyone else?
Oh, I can't switch between the windows. That's why technical issues. I found a project on providing clean water to population of very different countries around the world, which is being supervised from Switzerland, which is interesting geographically because the countries involved like Chile, South Africa, Islamic Republic of Iran, Vietnam, they are just from around the world. Interesting geography. Yes, I didn't have enough time because of my poor English to read it thoroughly. But I think it's interesting if a developed country such as Switzerland has a well-developed technology, why not spreading it around the world to the places that really need it? That's how should it work.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, there's so many benefits from it. Good, thank you.
Also,
Kate, yeah.
Looked at small hydropower projects done in Uganda. But,
there seem to be quite a few of hydropower.
Yes, quite interesting how none of the benefits that they have stated is beneficial to the community because they have stated that it's non-applicable.
We can't hear you that well, Kate.
Okay, let me try.
Yeah. Spot on, Michael. Yeah, this feels.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Go on.
Okay. Yes. So I was saying that it looks like the benefits that was intended for the project, which is the hydro project, does not reflect because all of the benefits, as in air quality, water, the natural resource, the growth, education, and welfare, all of them states that it's non-applicable. Unlike the one who spoke first, he talked about the Kenyan one. So I'm just wondering what makes the difference over here, because both of them are in Africa and they are all hydropower projects. Yes.
Yeah, good point. I mean, in this same page, this is just the SD co-benefit report, but you also have the project design. So it could potentially be that there are other CDM in the project in that area offering some of the other co-benefits, which you mentioned, which you couldn't find in this CDM project. That's one potential possibility. The other possibility is that the need for certain benefits might be more in some areas. It also depends on what is the scope available. So I think multiple factors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I can see that.
Yeah. Because we are talking about a whole ecosystem. Generally, what tends to happen with CDM is if you have one project, then there is a cluster there as well. Because, only because you have project proposers who, can see what's happening on the ground and someone else might propose. So that also leads to a cluster of projects, which means that the co-benefits are spread around. At the end of the day, there's, air quality is just one thing in that area. If one project is able to improve it, then the other projects have to make sure they can't go, spoil it again, but they can't do extra to improve it even more, right?
Yeah, true.
So it could be that as well, the clustering of CDM. But that also, takes us into another issue as to the spread of CDM projects in that country itself as well as around the world. There's very unequal spread. Now that's the issue with voluntary, a mechanism over here. So there's no particular regulation that this is where the projects need to go. So that also creates the issue of it just goes where there are opportune conditions. So yeah. Right. What we'll do is we'll take a short break and then we'll come back. So at the moment is 8 o'clock for you guys, or like 1 minute wait. So let's get back in about 10 minutes and to go on to look at climate finance. Right. Let's commence. I think that's a good 10 minutes. Are some of you back?
Yes, Professor, I'm here.
Okay. Trickling back, I think. Back. Okay. More back. All right, let's give it another minute then. So what's news from there this week?
We have tons of news every day, to be honest. Interesting time. But we are happy you are with us. You know, in such a difficult times, it's good to have that international academic communication of that level you provide us with.
Yeah,
and
I like it too.
About American English, I don't think there is such a thing like American language. I think English is something that comes from England. So
there's very distinctly American English spelling. Only spelling.
You know, I've been studying in Soviet school in conventional, regular, ordinary one. And our teachers kept saying, what we are teaching you is Royal English. That's how the royal family.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're obviously part of Europe and we are part of Europe in the same way. So you will be using British English, really.
I remember my first days in England back in 2008. I wasn't able to understand anything. People were talking around, like where I am.
Okay, yes, I get that as well. Because when they say Royal English, right? I mean, there are how you use words, how you pronounce them, all that makes a difference. So there's something called RP, right? Received pronunciation. So you hear it in a certain way and it's learned in a certain way. Or, you know, some people will call it the Queen's English because we've had the Queen for ages now, or had her. But then you have a London accent again. So in England, it's so the accent is different. When I meant the British English and the American English, it was very specifically the spelling, because there's a very distinct difference. There are many words, like, for example, program. American English is program. British English is programme. Right? So more recently, American English has been used around the world more. It's just a result of, you know, more globalization, because a lot more American ideas have been globalized than some other ideas or you know, language. And it's also because their popular culture is so out there, both print media and yes, they speak in English. So there's this, but for those of us who have grown up with the British English spelling, when I mark essays, it really annoys me to find spellings that are not British English, because I think it's wrong spelling. yeah, some of us feel quite strongly about it. Anyway, yeah, cultural wars. That seems to also be a part of the times nowadays, you know, cultural wars.
And I think American humor, well, and it is a very important thing, will never be the same as British
Yes,
humor.
yes.
I remember the show Little Britain, I think. Yes, it was my favorite.
Oh yeah, they're very good at yeah, lots of stand-up parody. I mean, we even had to create a new you know, exception based on parody. In the last 20 years, we have had a change of intellectual property law here in England and Wales, especially to allow exception of parody, because otherwise it will be infringing copyrights. You know, you can't do parody without actually using the original material. But because it's such a British form of entertainment, we wanted to allow that cultural experience. So we then said parody, you know, cannot be considered an infringement or cannot be considered spin. So yeah, you're right. We do have very specific, yeah, cultural soft power from United Kingdom is pretty strong. Yeah. Yeah, we make a lot of money out of it too. I think there's lots of British TV programs go to America as well. I don't know how much you get to see any there, but there are so many programs here that there's almost a channel that keeps putting British television on in America.
I think they pretty much of them travel around the good ones.
Possibly.
Even in the case with Little Britain, here in Russia, we used to have Nasha Russia show, Our Russia, which is a copy from Little Britain. It's completely different, but when you see it, how it's made, even the music, the fonts, you understand it is the same. No one in Russia knows that because they don't know what is Little Britain. If you search for Nasha Russia, but it might be difficult because it's in Russian without any translation. But yes, they travel around. Soft power is a soft power. Sometimes it is more important than rockets and bombs, etc. Yes. And Western civilization was quite successful with that, with spreading it around.
Yeah, only because you have the internet, now you have other things, you know, being spread a bit more easily as well. I mean, if you look at YouTube now, there's quite a bit of, you know, lots of, I mean, globalization in the more diverse sense of globalization rather than, you know, exports kind of being concentrated from some regions onto other regions or some types of material being exported. Yeah, interesting times. There's a lot more opportunities, but again, that also gives rise to what directions we all take in our day-to-day as well. There's so many choices and options. Yeah. Maybe thinking about climate change will give us some perspective on some of these options. You know, some of these options may be good, some of these options might not be as good from a perspective of, you know, a sustainable climate resilient future. Right. Okay, let's move on to the second part. Let me share my screen. Okay. The second part of today was climate finance. What is climate finance? So let's look at what's generally referred to as climate finance. So this could be of, you know, borrowing and lending or passing money on by grants at any level, at a local level, within a country, it could be at the national level, or it could be transnational financing, right? So climate finance encompasses various spaces. And it can come from anywhere. Okay, in general, when climate finance is referred to, it can come from anywhere. It can be drawn from public sources. It can be drawn from private and alternative sources of financing. Yeah, so it is really that the world of finance has definitely been impacted quite a lot by this opportunity as well as the challenge being presented by climate change. But what makes finance, specifically climate finance, is that it is directed at two of the key objectives that we have. One is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, another is to adapt to any of the climate risks that materialize. Okay, so any local, national, transnational financing by any private, public, or alternate source towards supporting mitigation and adaptation actions will be considered as climate finance. Yeah. And you'll see why you need this breadth of an understanding of climate finance, because, you know, money within the UN is very, very meager. There's a very good reason why you need to have a wide and expansive understanding of what constitutes climate finance. Let's look at what the treaties themselves talk about. How is finance created? How is climate finance created as part of the treaties? What obligations do states have? The 1994 agreement, the UNFCCC, developed country parties are to provide financial resources to assist developing country parties, yeah? Directly drawing from the principle of differentiation that we know well by now is part of the UN climate regime. So those that have industrialized and emitted quicker and faster and earlier than others, they are the ones who need to provide financial assistance to developing countries, both for mitigation as well as adaptation. Yeah, and both of those address goals in the UNFCCC. By providing assistance to developing countries for mitigation, then the overall goal of emission reduction is gained, as well as sustainable development is realized, provided the projects are directed in the right way. Then by helping adaptation, they also undertake, you know, better peace and security. They'll address problems such as, you know, reduction of climate migrants if the countries then, you know, become unbearable to live in. So they contribute towards that by adaptation finance, climate finance. What about the Paris Agreement of 2015? So it certainly reaffirmed the obligations of developed countries, okay? And we'll see what's happened, you know, from 1994 up until now in terms of the evolution of climate finance through the treaty mechanism. The Paris Agreement for the first time also encouraged voluntary contributions by all of the parties, right? So this is the idea that the climate regime now has taken on a significance and taken on so many areas within its breadth that all parties will anyway be doing one or the other thing around it. Because if you think about how Paris Agreement now talks about loss and damage, and how we saw in the very first session when I talked about what happened in the COP in Dubai in 2023, a new loss and damage fund was established. So that means the whole spectrum of the countries that are now being directly affected by the impacts of climate change, countries and regions that are adapting to, you know, the damage that changes in the climate are giving rise to, as well as the other countries who are the developed countries themselves. So all of them in some way or the other are directly being brought into the fold in many ways under the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, that's the difference between the treaty goals of the UN FFFC and PA, As far as UNFFC was concerned, it directly said developed countries to give to developing countries. In this, it said developed countries need to give, but then everyone else should contribute as well. Okay, so what do we need the money for? We need the money to fulfill all of the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. So that means we need money for mitigation. We do need money for adaptation. We need money for loss and damage, all of them, okay? Now, as far as mitigation is concerned, we looked at carbon finance, you know, as a specific type of a finance that is about producing that emissions reductions benefit, while at the same time producing some development benefits as well. So the part of climate finance that takes care of mitigation is set out as part of the CDM. But other than that, what else, where else is money coming from? Well, a big share of the money towards mitigation is coming from the country's own budgets, right? So the taxpayer money and other ways in which countries can raise finance. Along with that, we have the multilateral financial bodies as well. The multilateral, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, as well as we have got other means by which money flows, business happens, right? So a lot of that does go into mitigation. So I'm not really going to focus so much on that mitigation side, but I'm going to focus more on adaptation. And another reason for focusing on adaptation is that there is a diversity of adaptation costs in comparison to the mitigation. The outcomes for mitigation are much more clearer than the outcomes for adaptation, because adaptation, there are so many different ways in which you can adapt, or the goals for adaptation are very diverse. Some would say diffuse as well. But now let's look at, focus on some sections of the Article 7, which is on adaptation, Article 7 of the Paris Agreement. So Article 7.4, this is a significantly different article to previous UNFCCC family of treaties and whatever is spoken about adaptation. So 7.4 encapsulates something quite different. It clearly states that parties recognize the current need for adaptation is significant. So within this, we can fit in the ideas about the peaking of greenhouse gas emissions, the fact that the peaking of greenhouse gas emissions of the world has not happened yet, which means that our emissions keep rising up. Only if we know that they have peaked, that they're going to come down on the way. So because as they keep rising, we can see the impact of the effects of it. And that's why we are then looking at it as adaptation, the current need for adaptation as being significant, because for the near future, it's only going to keep increasing more and more, the need for adaptation. So that has been recognized for quite some time. When this was recognized in 2015, it wasn't the same as, let us say, 2023 or 2024. But however, the trajectory was exactly in the same direction of the need increasing. Greater levels of mitigation can reduce the need for additional adaptation efforts. So for the first time, you see the linkages between mitigation and adaptation. This is a section on adaptation, but we are saying that if mitigation is not expected at the level it should be, or at the pace at which it should be, that means there'll be more adaptation efforts. So it's almost sort of talking about mitigation as that first point. Yeah. So in general, this is definitely the case, because if you are able to keep stable, or if you're able to try and, not add at the same rate to the atmosphere, the GHGs, then the additional adaptation efforts that may be required may be lesser. But at the moment, additional adaptation efforts are required. So this also links back to the whole notion of the planetary boundary framework. Yeah, and if you remember, there was a graph which showed that when we talk about what are the planetary boundaries, there is a particular band within which you can place the boundary. So but using the precautionary principle, the boundary was placed more in the middle of the band rather than in either side of the bands, right? So you still have this sort of a range within which this breach of a certain, ability of the planet to be stable in its systems, whether it's the atmosphere, whether it is its biosphere, all its different systems. So we've got to link it to that actual physical effect that greenhouse gas emissions are providing. So greater levels of mitigation or lesser levels of mitigation will increase the additional adaptation efforts that are required. Okay, so, and then greater adaptation needs can involve greater adaptation costs. Okay, so there you go. That could come about from n number of scenarios. Because there may be a particular solution for making your house flood proof. But if the floods go beyond what is physically expected there because of the modeling, being based on Earth systems rather than local ecological systems, then you are going to see that particular, building, that it could take a certain breadth, but beyond that, it needs to actually be completely changed to another technology, or you might have to completely give that place up and move somewhere else because of the recurrent costs, right? So there could be n number of reasons why greater adaptation needs then can involve greater adaptation costs. So now in 7.4, you start seeing this difference in how mitigation and adaptation costs can happen. Because the more you put into mitigation, the more you get benefits in so many ways. So the costs in some ways can be recouped either as monetary investment, or it can be recouped through other social benefits, which you can then also lay, a monetary value on, because you can talk about, like, for example, air quality can be talked about as an ecosystem service, which in economics can then also be costed or accounted for in a certain way. Okay, so mitigation, the way the cost-benefit analysis happens is different to adaptation, because adaptation almost seems to be a lot of spend, and spend with much lesser return from a monetary perspective, but potentially some return from a social perspective, or sometimes it is only about maintaining the status quo of that society. So keeping that community, keeping your house in a position that it has been before, or it is now, so that it doesn't get worse. So the way in which adaptation cost financing can be viewed is very different to the way in which mitigation costs are viewed as well. So given that this is the background of the nature of, spending on these two aspects, Article 4 makes that really significant point, and it establishes, saying we are going to, significantly need to spend more on adaptation. One way of reducing that is to make sure that we keep to our mitigation targets. Now, that also has an impact on how much you can offset, yeah? Because you want to actually deeply decarbonize, not decarbonize by way of decarbonization plus offset. You want to reduce as much as possible of the offset, because your adaptation efforts then can correspondingly be manageable. But if you did go down the non-deep decarbonization route, your adaptation costs are going to increase. So there's quite a lot of entanglement over here in terms of the adaptation, mitigation, and risks and costs. So there's another significant provision Article 7.5, which has a number of parts to it, which is relevant to how finance can be spent, what principles should underpin climate finance spending on adaptation. According to Article 7.5, any adaptation action should follow a country-driven approach, should follow a gender-responsive approach, should follow a participatory, fully transparent approach. Now, this is very good from a human rights equality perspective, from a gender, from a, sovereign, independent exercise of power perspective, so country-driven, participatory, again, human rights, giving everyone a voice, fully transparent approach, procedural justice. So it brings benefits for all of this, but what does it also do in terms of adaptation financing? It adds a lot more risk, okay? So projects which have so many different variables means they're also higher risk to be able to finance, and there will be only that many funds, or there'll be restricted number of funds which will take on that higher level of risk, right? Because when it comes to finance, you're always looking at the risk, reduction of risk, and return on the value of the money that's being put in. But Article 7.5 quite clearly lays this out. Where do they want adaptation financing costs, adaptation financing to go? They want it to go into vulnerable groups, communities, ecosystems. It's only fair that it should really go there. What should it be based on? What adaptation approaches should be funded should be based on a number of factors, including what is the best available science? What is the appropriate traditional knowledge? What is the knowledge of the indigenous people? What is the local knowledge systems? So previously, it was very much scientific, okay? So you're looking at, if I want to make sure the building structure of my house is protected from the climate risk, then you go very much structural and, enlist an expert in materials, enlist an expert in, structural buildings, etc. Whereas if you took the approach of, taking local knowledge, or depending on, where you are, indigenous, traditional knowledge, then you're going to be looking at things like nature-based solutions as well. You're going to be looking at alternative approaches. So now the question is, if you are, it takes time, it takes resources, because you do need another expert in traditional knowledge, you need another expert in indigenous knowledge. But why should it be done? Because it's not just adaptation, but it's also making sure in the process of, so anything that you do as part of adaptation also goes towards activities that take place for either development or lack of development in that region. Okay, because you live in the house, you are enjoying the house. The action that you take in response to the climate risk not only just provides resilience against it, but it also provides, it's a way in which you have spent the money on the house renovation. It's the way, so how you spend the money will determine who gets jobs and whose knowledge is valued, etc., etc. So what Article 7.5 is saying is that if adaptation has to take place, it has to take place under these principles, then any adaptation finance for that also has to take into account these principles. So these principles then also make it more higher risk as well. So from a finance perspective, it's more difficult to raise finance for all of this. So just to delve a little bit more into the aspects of, okay, what are the threats? What are the solutions available? What about the finance? Yeah, they're not going to, although they look like 3 columns, I'm not going to say this is the threat, this is a solution for this threat, and this is the finance mechanism for this, right? It's not going to correlate like that, but we'll generally look at, okay, if you want to know about the latest position on threats, where do you need to go? From a global level, a good place for you to go is to look at the United Nations Environment Programme. From a national level, various governments do it differently. In the UK, we have something known as the CCRA, the Climate Change Risk Register. So every year it's revised with input from meteorological services, input from ground services, water services, ecological. So it's like a lot of different technical information that's gathered and put in there. And then they talk about, okay, so this year the main thing is we're going to have a lot more heavy winds, right? So that's definitely a climate risk as far as UK is concerned. In some areas, there is definitely flooding. And in few coastal areas, we are going to have sea level rises, but we also are going to have some subsidences and loss of land that, you know, goes into the sea, etc. So this is something that other countries also have in various shapes and forms. But I will direct you to a report that was released in 2022. This is the Adaptation Gap Report. Now, if you recall, in one of the earlier sessions, I talked about the emissions gap report, meaning where we should be and where we actually are. So the gap between, you know, we are heading towards a 2.7 degree global average rise, right? So that's where we are heading towards, but where we should be is 2-degree rise at the most, but aiming for 1.5. So that means that is the emissions gap. And here, to keep that same kind of terminology, here is the adaptation gap, meaning that it's not looking that good for us. As you can see, that cover of that report itself is pretty ominous. You know, humanity seems to be represented by a little girl who seems to be, you know, pretty phased by that whole big black cloud that's looming straight there. So that's the gathering storm. So it's both figurative and even almost accurate about what the dangers are from climate, from global warming. So what kind of threats? Severe floods. These are definitely materializing ones. Severe floods, long-term droughts, worsening forest fires, not exhaustive. Nature of threats. So what are we trying to adapt to? It is these. So you've got to think about not when severe floods happen. That is loss and damage. What is adaptation is? A severe flood happened here last year, and that was climate linked. So the possibility of severe floods happening again is going to happen. So adaptation finance needs to understand how to lessen the impact of the severe flood, or how to completely neutralize the impact on people of the severe flood. So adaptation is both, it's mainly people and property, because, you know, property is attached to us. We own it, we have it, but also to natural environments. So things like if you have a reserved forest, or if you've got protected areas over which, I mean, we protect these areas because they have benefits for human society in various ways. Maybe they provide good air quality. Maybe they provide other kind of ecosystem services. So therefore, it's not what we are adapting for is climate risk. What all we are helping adapt is humans, human life, our property, as well as any other natural environment that we protect for various benefits. So that's the sort of adaptation finance risks that we're talking about. These are the threats. So what sort of solutions are being put in place for addressing some of these threats? So stronger housing, okay? So think about various types of housing around the world. There's all types of different types of living. People live right from, you know, living on the water to living in very high places to ordinary sort of city living, etc. So we're talking about all types of housing. We are also talking about housing that comes from, I mean, the risks that come to housing directly, or the risks that come to people who live within certain houses. So for example, in the UK, if we have longer periods of warm weather, the houses that we live in, you know, don't have enough, they can protect us very much from the cold, but when it comes to heat, it's not built in the same way as, let's say, you know, a house in India, in South India, where they're so much more used to having houses for very high temperatures. right? So it's also those kind of comforts for people living within the house, which we have to reflect in the housing, and that is being changed. That's changed because of how the weather has changed. So stronger housing means both infrastructurally as well as for the people within the houses. More drought-tolerant crops. So food security is one of the big issues. Again, something that has now come centrally in the agenda for from COP this 2023 onwards. But there are two issues. One is food security, which means the amount of food that's being produced for the amount of people that are there to consume it. That's one aspect. The other aspect is much more local, and it's more of a justice issue. So, for example, in parts of Egypt, they face a huge amount of desertification problem. So they may not satisfy, their production may not ever satisfy or be sent out for export for, outside, coming into the food market around the world, but they their own food consumption over there is completely changed or has to change because they're not able to grow the crops that they have always been able to for their own consumption. So there is that local justice aspects that we don't see as well, that we don't hear about in many of the food security debates. So yeah, Chad again is another example. And thinking about it geographically, it's sort of, in the same region of Northern Africa, where you have the Sahara Desert onwards, which is highly affected by the changes. It's very highly sensitive area for temperature changes and how the land reacts to it. Social safety nets. So there could be technical solutions like housing and drought-tolerant crops, but they could also be governance changes. So social safety nets, making sure if floods and your house is lost, that there is somewhere you can go to. Maybe it's a community shelter, or maybe you can go to friends, or you can go to family. So what sort of safety nets have you got, and whether we need to strengthen those sort of arrangements. So adaptation finance can actually go towards these solutions as well. Improve decision-making around climate-related risks. So early warning systems, putting in place saying, well, we might not have monsoon, or we might not have rains this year okay, how do you actually adapt? So resources need to be spent for all of this. So you can see that the solutions range from low risk to high risk solutions, right? So what do I mean by high risk solutions? The return on that might not be necessarily accurate, yeah? So let's say that you put in a new early warning system that may, like any other weather system, it could predict right, or it could predict, there's a huge degree of error that's possible. Whereas maybe, stronger housing, it's a more sure shot kind of a solution where you can, it'll do what it says on the tin more surely than this other example I gave. Different to, so here's the point saying the solutions for mitigation are much easier to finance because the goal is singular, reduction of GHG. So what kind of mitigation activities are funded through climate finance? Installation of solar panel, manufacturing electric vehicle. So these are examples where there's more immediate return and there's more certain financial return, right? But compare that to social safety nets, compare that to early warning system. All of that, the return is not in the same way. So there is a disparity in the structural arrangements for adaptation financing. So you can ask the question, do we now need to look at the structure of financing? Yeah, so structure of financial instruments, that's a whole area of research. Yeah, what new financial instruments needs to be created? There are quite a few being created as well, okay? So that's a whole area that can be looked into to say, what type of financial instruments are now resulting from the UN climate regime? So what type of finance is part of climate finance? There's loans, there's grants, there's bonds. There's grants would be ideal. Yeah. So can someone tell me why grants is more ideal than loans when it comes to finance? You're all students. Do you want a student grant or a student loan?
A grant is more likely to be taken because it's not subject to be returned usually.
Exactly. Exactly. You're not going to pay interest on that, right? Grants, loans. So here's an issue that's now coming up. What did we see in 7.4, Article 7.4? If mitigation efforts don't actually pick up pace, you are going to have more adaptation costs. And that is materializing now. I mean, what have we seen in the last few years? We definitely hear more of disaster events that take place, right? So that means if you are going to get financing for adaptation through loans, you're going to also have to be paying large amounts of interest. So your indebtedness of countries are going to increase as well. So sovereign indebtedness is a big issue. It's very difficult to shake it off. You know, it keeps racking up. It's quite difficult to shake it off. I mean, even countries like the United States, know what that actually means, because there isn't a single country in the world that doesn't have a debt. Yeah. But there are some countries that have debts and have consequences that come because they haven't paid their debt. So currently, it is a huge issue that now many countries are refusing to take loans for adaptation. So that's another issue for loss and damage as well. In some ways, you could say, well, if you had adapted, perhaps your loss and damage might not have been great. But the countries are going to, like developing countries and least developed countries, are going to come back and say, well, we don't want to take loans because all that is happening is we are becoming more and more indebted. So that's a real problem currently in climate finance. The refusal to take loans because of the nature of the finance mechanism. Okay, so what kind of finance is required for adaptation? What is the projections that are being made? So according to the UNEP program, we need somewhere between 140 billion to 300 billion every year by 2030. And we will need between 280 to 500 billion up to 2050 onwards. So this trajectory is based on, even if we are going to meet the 2050 net zero target, okay? And you can see the wide range that is there because the modeling all depends on whether you're going to have an escalation of the risk or is it going to follow just an incremental increase in the risk. Even last year, there have been revisions of quite a few climate models about based on what actually happened. What they predicted 2 years ago happened in a different way last year. So they had to go back and set right the model. So the range comes from, 140 to 300 billion by 2030, which we have to look and ask, we have to do something about it now because it's a 2030 target. Countries plan on yearly basis, on a 5-yearly basis. We saw that as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned, you've got 3 levels of mitigation, right? The third level being the LTLEDS. So we have the nationally determined contribution, then we have the long-term low emission development strategies, LTLDDS. So the 2030 and the 2050 all fall within the realm of LTLDDS. And what we see in the LTLDDS is there are nearly about 20% of the emissions of all countries are saying it's unavoidable. So that's like 1/5 of the emissions. So that brings us to the question of what is the seriousness of the mitigation efforts? They should really be more serious. They should really be reducing it at a much faster rate because there is no way the climate finance is really keeping up with it. Okay, so a multilateral development bank, the International Monetary Fund, they talk about the expenditure that a country makes as a proportion of its gross domestic product. So adaptation costs exceed 1% of GDP per year in about 50 of the low-income and developing economies. And this could be rising up to 20% of the GDP for these small island nations who are exposed to tropical cyclones and rising seas. So tremendous adaptation costs that we're talking about over here. Right, so what are the treaty mechanisms that we have in place for gathering money? The different types of funds that there are. Even when the 1994 treaty came into place, there was a setup. The Global Environment Facility was set up. This still continues to be one of the financial facilitating mechanisms for global climate finance flows through the multilateral system. So GEF still funds. If you go onto the GEF's website, you can see there is a separate portal there for climate finance. Then there were some special funds set up as well. The Special Climate Change Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund. There was an adaptation fund that was again set up separately in 2001. There was also the Green Climate Fund. So this was set up in Cancun, which threw a lot of light on adaptation. So the Green Climate Fund got established at that point in time. It's currently functional as well. A lot of all of the considerations I've talked about so far in terms of what are the adaptation risks and what are the methods of financing, all of those are sorted through the institutional mechanisms of the GEF and the GCF. So just harking back to the grand bargain that was struck in 2015, because in international climate governance and law, the Paris Agreement marked a big change, right? And it's very significant in the context of climate finance because the carrot that was extended to the countries that previously did not have any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol was that you will get more climate finance, right? So that was the bargain that was struck. So they said, look, in Paris Agreement, let all parties submit nationally determined contributions. Let's not make a difference between developed and developed countries. However, what we will say is that developed countries, or the countries that have been more responsible for GHG emissions, will give more climate finance. So that was the grand bargain that was set. Why countries agreed to all submit NDCs. So the background for this is from the Copenhagen Accord. So at that time, they committed saying developed countries, all collectively, they will mobilize every year 100 billion in climate finance by 2020. Okay, any guesses? It didn't really happen. They only covered about 34% of that fund that was promised out of the 100 billion. Now they have said that prior to 2025 COP, they're going to have a new kind of a yearly target. So they're going to have 100 billion USD as the floor or the minimum. They're going to have an annual target of climate finance that developed countries will put together over 100 billion pounds. Now, we saw what was needed. So 140 to 300 up to 2030, right? So that means above 100 billion certainly, but should be closer to what the real adaptation costs are calculated to be. So this was how the different sets of countries accepted the Paris Agreement. So all countries would commit to more ambitious climate action, and developing countries would require enhanced support from developed countries to do so, right? Okay, so finally, we're going to take an extra few minutes here. So we know the situation now. we know we need more of finance. We also know that the way finance works is also difficult to be able to meet the goals of, returns over finance, etc. So given the background, we know we have to increase adaptation finance. Yeah. All the predictions, they say the adaptation costs are going to go up. What are the discussions around this? Firstly, stronger political commitment. Don't just, fulfill 34% out of the 100% of a fund that you've set up. Okay, 34% is really, really low. So how can that come about? It's only the state parties. Yeah, governments have to, developed countries have to be able to fulfill that commitment of 100 billion every year for helping with climate finance. That has to come about. So we need to have stronger political commitment. We need to have strengthened institutional capacity in public and private sector. So this is that whole area of where is being money spent within countries? Yeah. Where are projects being done? Either by the private sector or the public sector. Okay, telecommunications project. Now, if that project is there, how can we ensure that there are adaptation benefits that are set into it, or even fully directed towards adaptation to climate risk? So we need to have institutional capacity that can understand how any project behind which money is being put is able to get some gains for that, for adaptation purposes. Better analysis and understanding of climate risk, because you need to have smart investment of the finance, means you need to have better analysis, better understanding of climate risk. And also you need to find cheaper, cost-effective ways of adaptation, right? But at the same time, you need to find just ways of adaptation too, right? So if you take, for example, health is one area of adaptation. And if you look at health, you've got many different health systems that you can invest in. You could invest in a health system which is, again, heavily supported through market mechanisms. For example, COVID vaccine and the health system that supported it. Vaccine was discovered, all well and good, but however, what is the cost of the vaccine? So if you go for a cure for COVID within that system, the costs of it is quite high. Whereas you could have perhaps, another option, or how much money was poured into perhaps another option. So we're going to have to look at what is the best way. So for example, flood defenses. Are you going to go for nature-based solutions? Plant more trees of a certain type, get the knowledge from those who know about trees and growing and long-term, as opposed to, let's say, build a wall over there. So you need to have a much better idea of options so you can analyze more and you can understand the nature of the risks. So this way, better measures of economic, social risks posed by climate change, better measures of financial and economic returns on investment designed to reduce these risks, right? So it's basically all hands on deck. It's a huge transformative operation on the economy. So the key things that need to be done from a treaty perspective, adaptation priorities must be got right. We need to track adaptation finance to know where the gaps are and where to plug the gaps. We need to integrate adaptation priorities into national planning, because as we can see, the GECF, the GEF, etc., can only do that much. The national planning, which is where the bulk of the world's money goes into, needs to integrate adaptation priorities into it much better. And for some countries, it's much easier to do this than other countries, given that the levels of governance in the public sector varies greatly between countries. Right. I'm not going to play this over here. That was not my intention, but this is a link to an actual video. This is the last section on inclusive on inclusive adaptation and inclusive financing, right? There's this particular session, it's like an hour and a half session that you can listen to. It's about inclusive, community-led climate change adaptation financing in informal settlements. It's a very good example of the opportunity and the challenges that are there in fulfilling Article 7.5. That adaptation must take into account the best available science and other types of knowledge, that it must be based in a participatory manner, and it must go to those that are most vulnerable, and it must be country driven, right? So, you know, there are lots of material around on the internet on lots of topics related to climate change. But if you look closely, there are material that have the most number of views or most number of listen, will all be basic ones. You know, what is climate change, or what is the Paris Agreement, or even those that are in forums, you know, such as the multilateral banks or the multilateral organizations, etc. But the reason why I've given you a direct link to this is because these kind of material don't get very much seen or heard, for that matter. And that's also why we have very less progress in, you know, moving towards just adaptation financing. So I urge you to go and listen to this particular recording. And finally, okay, for those of you who need to leave, feel free to leave, but I'm just going to play a 3-minute video here. It just helps us understand it from a country perspective. And I've picked Namibia, again, from that same site where I have picked the previous video, because I'd like. Can you hear? Yeah.
No, there is no sound, Professor.
You can't hear?
We can't hear anything.
Yes?
Nope.
Okay.
I see the video, but I can't hear the sound.
Ah, you can't hear the sound?
Yes.
All right, sorry about that. Let me see if I can get the sound going. What did I do last time to include the sound? Oh, maybe. What I'll do is I'll leave the link on there. You guys can have a look at it, because I'm just aware that, you know, we've gone over the time and it's quite a lot to take in. So as usual, I share the slides and then you can watch it there. It's a really nice video. You should watch it. It's not long. Let me just stop the recording. And any